So Jessica, thank you for getting this organized. Scott, thank you for the introduction and for, as you'll see, setting up the discussion I want to have. For those of you who are live, feel free to pivot towards the stage and to make sure you're able to get the story straight on. These issues are hard enough to get straight if you're looking at the speaker, never mind if you're set aside. I am just back from this gathering in Scotland, the so-called Conference of the Parties number 26. And does anyone know why it's COP26? All right, anyone online want to offer? It is the 26th gathering of the countries that signed on to the original 1992 Framework Convention on Climate Change. And this was meant to have occurred a year ago, but the original COP26 that was planned for 2020, of course, didn't take place. So it was pushed off. But it is the 26th time that this group of countries, now numbering just under 200, have come together to talk about how to advance this climate change agenda, how to bring the world together to respond to the threat of the buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And of course, it was, I think, quite an interesting moment. And as you're going to hear me say, I think it's in some regards a watershed moment. And we'll dig into the details of that. But the world has definitely come to recognize there are some fundamental sustainability concerns. And there's been a good bit of academic work and broader scientific work on what are now described as the planetary boundaries that our human life is pushing up against. And the fact that we are approaching 8 billion people on this planet means that we actually do have, as humanity, an impact on these critical natural resources, the Earth systems that support us. So, of course, one of those boundaries is the buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that threaten us with climate change. But there are others, the loss of biodiversity, the species diversity of the planet. There are issues around the water and the cycling of water in the planet. So all of this has become quite an interesting issue, on a series of issues, really. I think for some, it could seem a discouraging moment, a challenging moment, a moment for pessimism. And I think some coming back from Glasgow were disappointed. The formal agreement that was reached, the so-called Glasgow Climate Pact, is quite modest. It moves the issue forward, but not very much. And I think the fact is that the world community was hoping to gather this year as well for a big discussion on biodiversity. There's a separate biodiversity treaty called the Convention on Biological Diversity, and it was having its COP15, which would, of course, be the 15th time that the parties to that agreement had gathered. But because of the pandemic, people were not able to go. It was in China, and the Chinese decided not to go forward. So that is going to be done next spring. But I think more than that, all of us have begun to see the challenges of sustainability around us, particularly the risks and threats of climate change. The terrible fires across the American West this year, but fires in Italy, in Greece, and in other countries, and floods in Germany and France and the Netherlands. A hurricane, an Atlantic hurricane season that was so record-breaking we ran out of letters of the alphabet to name the storms. So I think this issue has suddenly come into kind of public understanding that we are facing challenges that need a response. And I do think that it is not just climate change, it is questions of water, of chemicals, of waste, of plastics. So it's a multidimensional challenge that we face. Now, having said that there's lots of challenges and there's reasons that one might be pessimism, I actually think this gathering in Glasgow provides some reason for optimism, some reason to think that we might be at a turning point. And in part, it's because of the kinds of things Scott was talking about. So let me just dig in and give you a quick report from the front lines of the sustainability challenge, particularly this meeting in Glasgow that took place over the last 2 weeks. And then it sets up not only the book that Scott talked about, the Values at Work book that I have out, but also the one that's being presented in the back of the room for those who are live. My other book of the last couple of years called A Better Planet, 40 Big Ideas for a Sustainable Future. And that does suggest, and that's another reason for optimism, that there are lots of people doing interesting work to think about how to advance this agenda of a more sustainable future, a future that is environmentally secure and frankly, economically successful, where there is a capacity for all of us to flourish in ways that have not been clear at some points in the past. So let's dig into a little bit what the world said and did in Glasgow and what people are going back, as I am just back, to report all over the world. So there were representatives from 196 countries. That's in fact good news. And it's particularly good news for a World Affairs Forum that is trying to think about ways to bring the world together. And the suggestion is that there are conversations going on. And frankly, I think the critical things that needed to be done in the official government-to-government conversation did happen. And by the way, I don't know, have any of you been to one of these conferences of the parties? No. So let me just step back and describe it for a moment. So these events take place in giant conference centers and there were on the high end of the number of people attending this year compared to recent years, about 25,000 people that were credentialed to go to this. So that's 4,000 or 5,000 government officials, representatives of governments all across the world. So the US government probably had 300 people there. Some smaller countries, the Bahamas probably had 4 people there. So it varies a lot. But around that government conversation is a further discussion in a set of pavilions that are near the government conversation center, which is, by the way, at the heart of that is a plenary hall that can seat 4,000 or 5,000 people. Then there are a series of breakout rooms because the conversations rarely are everybody all together. Usually there's a conversation in one space on forests and another space on finance for climate change action and a third conversation going on carbon removal. So there's all separate issues that are being discussed in different places. People come together on the first and second day when the leaders present their big picture, and they come together on the last day when there's an attempt to bring an agreement to a close. But around that government kind of core of this complex are hundreds of pavilions. So it's actually an ideas festival at the same time, with more than 1,000 panels presented over the course of 2 weeks in these different pavilions, some of which are sponsored by countries, some of which are sponsored by environmental groups or other NGOs, non-governmental organizations, some of which are think tanks or universities, some of which are companies and industries. So all sorts of conversations going on. So for me, what's interesting is not only what the governments are saying, but what everybody else is saying about how the world is going to advance this agenda, whatever it is the government set as the direction. And I do think that governments did come forward with one big breakthrough, which was to say we need to head for a world of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by mid-century. By the way, there was a lot of people that were hoping it would say by 2050. Does anyone know why we didn't say 2050? Because the Chinese have only agreed to be net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2060. And India had said nothing until their prime minister got to Glasgow, and Prime Minister Modi committed India to a net zero greenhouse gas emissions future in 2070. By the way, he thought he was going to get a lot of happy people around 2070, but instead he was booed because a lot of people think that's too late. You can't really wait that long. Nevertheless, from my point of view, better to have India join the parade, albeit at the back, than not be part of the parade at all. So in that regard, it was some progress. By the way, net zero greenhouse gas emissions does not mean zero. It means that we will reduce substantially, but there's probably some residual. In fact, there's a very difficult residual to get rid of because some activities you can almost not do without fossil fuels. And there's some other greenhouse gases that are going to be hard to drive to zero as well. We'll talk about that in a moment. So the theory is you're going to drive the emissions down dramatically, perhaps 95%, and that last residual will be offset, which means that we will try to increase the uptake of carbon dioxide, which you probably all know is done by green plants, by photosynthesis. So the green plants need to be expanded to absorb more carbon dioxide to offset that last increment. By the way, as I mentioned briefly, there is another conversation going on around what's known as carbon removals. which is an engineered approach to carbon capture. So there's two kinds of offsets possible: nature-based solutions, more trees, more green plants, better management of land, wherever green things are growing, photosynthesis is taking place, and separately the possibility, and frankly, it's at this point not economical at all, but the possibility of directly capturing carbon dioxide out of the air and holding on to it. So whether that turns out to be ever economical is still a question. In any case, the formal government agreement did say we're going to end up with net zero greenhouse gas emissions mid-century. There was work done on something called the Paris Rulebook, referring to the 2015 Paris Climate Change Agreement, and some of the structures needed to set up what are called carbon markets. The idea that you're going to put a price on carbon dioxide. And one of the ways to do that is with a straight out charge, making people pay directly for the harm they cause. Another way is through what's known as a cap and trade program, where you cap the amount of emissions and you make anyone who's emitting buy an allowance. And then you allow the allowances to be traded so that people who are more successful than they thought in driving down their own emissions have extra allowances, and they can sell them to people who are having trouble reducing emissions and who otherwise would perhaps have to shut a facility. They're allowed to go and buy extra allowances. So there was rules set out for how that process would work, including across countries. Now, one of the goals that a lot of people hoped would come out of this conversation in Glasgow was a commitment to enough emissions reductions, country by country, that we would not see global emissions rise over the coming decades beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius. The current trajectory, by the way, is for something above 3 degrees. So there's a lot of worry that we're not where we need to be. If everyone did what they said they would do in 2015 in the Paris Agreement, the emissions could have been held to about 2 degrees. So that's kind of the baseline goal. But the recent science analysis, again, done by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the famous group that is a network of scientists across the world, won the Nobel Prize a decade or so ago alongside Al Gore for their work in laying out the science of climate change. They've done a recent assessment, their 6th assessment, and they have said that we really need to aim at a more aggressive target of emissions reductions to prevent the global warming from being above 1.5 degrees. So they're really pushing for a much more rapid and significant emissions reduction. And I think the conclusion coming out of Glasgow was that people did ramp up commitments in some cases and some places, and that if everyone fulfilled what they now say they're going to do, emissions could be limited to the point where we won't hit the 1.5 degrees or stay within that, but we could come under 2 degrees Celsius of warming, maybe around 1.8. So that's worrisome still, but better than where we were. So my conclusion, though, was, having spent some time there in this conference hall and going to some of the events outside the conference hall, that we've seen an interesting transformation, and Scott foreshadowed it. It turns out, I think, that the main event, which was meant to be this government-to-government conversation, receded a bit. And these side events in the pavilions and in hotels nearby really became the main story. So in fact, the sideshow became the main show. And I want to tell you about that. Because what it turns out is there were some number of government agreements, but not universal agreements. There were what we call plurilateral agreements. So a subset of the 200 countries present said, we are going to do something together. For example, one big agreement was on methane emissions. Some of you may not even know that there are multiple greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide the most important, but methane is a very significant second concern. Why is methane of such concern? Does anyone know? It's much more potent as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. Depending on how you do the methodological assessment, at least 30 times more heat trapping potential. And some people would say it could be as much as 80 times more potent. Now, it has an interesting alternative perspective in that it lasts only 10 to 20 years in the atmosphere compared to carbon dioxide that lasts hundreds of years. So it's short-lived, but very potent. So if you care about making a big difference quickly, going after methane matters. And for the first time in the 30 years I've been working on this issue, going back to the 1992 original treaty, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, this is the first time methane has been front and center. So that's one big breakthrough. But again, it wasn't everyone that agreed to it. 100 or so countries said that they would reduce their methane emissions across that country by 30% by 2030. And that's a big push in terms of suppressing the warming and the climate change we might otherwise have been threatened with. By the way, it puts in high profile some industries. Number one, the natural gas industry, because natural gas is methane. So when it leaks from the system of distribution or exploration, we have methane going into the atmosphere. Again, at 30, 40, 50, maybe 60 or 70 times as much impact as a similar amount of carbon dioxide. So there was, I think, for quite a long time, including when I was the commissioner of Connecticut's Department of Energy and Environmental Protection for a number of years, 2011 to 14, there was a big push at that time to shift people off burning oil or coal, both in power plants and in home heating, toward natural gas as a much cleaner fossil fuel. And in fact, when you shut a coal burning power plant and convert it to natural gas, you do cut in half the greenhouse gas emissions, and by much more than that, the local air pollution. So there's good reason to think that natural gas was a potential bridge to a clean energy future. But that bridge is getting shorter now with this focus on methane as a problem. And it puts a lot of intense pressure on that industry to really reduce the leakage of natural gas in its system. Who else is in the hot seat now? The world of beef. A lot of this methane is coming out both the front and the back end of cows and cattle. And so that is a serious challenge. And I think one of the things that comes out of Glasgow is a sense that there's a lot of transformative change required to really move to a sustainable future, to bring climate change under control. But some industries face more fundamental challenges than others. And frankly, the beef industry and the dairy industry are now in the center stage, let's put it that way. There was also an agreement on forests, a commitment by 120 countries to end deforestation by 2030. Of course, this is critical because those forests are what we call a carbon sink. They're where the carbon dioxide is being taken up. So every time trees are cut, we lose that ability to suck up the carbon that's out there, carbon dioxide. And by the way, when people burn the trees to clear the forest, to do planting of crops or grazing of cattle, we have a double hit because the burning of the trees puts carbon dioxide into the air, and we've lost the sink, the ability to absorb carbon dioxide. So this forest agreement could be quite important. Again, not a universal agreement, but 120 countries, including Brazil. So that's a pretty big deal. A third agreement, only 40 countries signed on to, was to stop having coal burning at all in your country. So 40 countries said no more coal. For the developed countries making that commitment, it was by 2030. For developing countries by 2040. But that agreement does not include China, does not include India, and does not include the United States of America. Does anyone want to guess why it does not include the United States? It's two words, derived from West Virginia. Joe Manchin. So that is the answer why the U.S. does not sign on. There were, though, other agreements that are of note. A breakthrough agenda was put forward, a 10-year commitment to innovation in critical sectors, hard to decarbonize, by which we mean hard to really reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, hard to decarbonize sectors like steel, cement, aviation, and a focused effort to really drive innovation to help those sectors transform. There was a lot of discussion, by the way, across all of the government formal discussions, the side events around, and beyond that in the streets, on the need for a just transition, on really paying attention to those who will be jarred by the move towards a clean energy future. And those jarred include people who are low income and who are going to face higher costs as we move to a cleaner energy structure. It includes people in the fossil fuel communities. We might call that the West Virginia problem as well. But we're not the only place that has a fossil fuel dependent set of communities, and people. And I think the fact that we have not in the past paid enough attention to how you get those folks to come along with change is shifting. People recognize now that's a critical political agenda, and frankly, an agenda of fairness. And that, I think, was, again, a big step forward. There was also a car agreement that was launched. 24 countries said they were going to phase out gasoline cars. Gasoline and diesel are going to be gone by 2040 in 24 countries. And there were a huge number of major automakers who signed on to that same phase out strategy, including Ford and General Motors. So these are the changes that make a difference, because once Ford and GM start retooling factories to make electric vehicles, you don't go back on that. You're going to invest. I think the CEO of GM said that she is planning to have the company invest $20 billion in repurposing factories for electric vehicles in the next decade. And again, once you've spent that, you don't undo it. So what's interesting here is the politics are almost off to the side, and business is focused on the long-term future in fundamental ways that I had not seen before. Another big breakthrough, the world of finance. So Scott's World was in Glasgow in a major way. There was a huge commitment of something called the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which was 450 banks and other financial institutions committing that their lending from here on out would be in alignment with the need to bring emissions down to net zero by 2050. So that's a very big deal, because you don't build coal-fired power plants unless somebody provides the capital. And basically, these institutions said no more money for coal-fired power plants. And frankly, I think they're tailing off even natural gas power plants. So how that plays out in detail will be interesting to see, but it suggests, given that they represent $130 trillion of assets, that there is a very big block of global money, global capital, that's now said publicly that they are going to work toward bringing these greenhouse gas emissions down over the next 30 years. Finally, please. I'm about to talk about that. So what was interesting was not only that you had all these pledges, but there were several things making me believe there was more seriousness of purpose behind it. Number one, there was a lot of energy in the street. We might even call it street theater, led by the famous Swedish 18-year-old activist Greta Thunberg. And does everyone know Greta's slogan of the conference? No more blah, blah, blah. And so she got a lot of attention. And in the halls where the formal meetings were, people would quote her and saying, wait a minute, you're giving us this pledge. Isn't that just more blah, blah, blah? What is beneath your pledge? What's real about it? If you're a business committing to net zero greenhouse gas emissions, and not just hundreds, thousands produced that pledge over the course of the 2 weeks in Glasgow, what's the underpinning? What's the business model transformation? How are you going to gauge your success? What metrics will you report? What interim targets will you hit? So there was a lot of pressure on people to do more than offer a pledge. And so I think that was one element. A second piece is that there's a very big push, and this is the world that Scott's in, of sustainability-minded investors who have decided that they want better alignment between their values, which might include a serious response to climate change or broader sustainability concerns, but those values they want to have aligned with their portfolios. And they're now insisting that people like Scott tell them about the environmental, social, and governance performance of the companies in their portfolios. So a big attention in Glasgow, reflecting a broader push of the last few years, as Scott indicated, for better information, better data, better indicators of who the sustainability leaders are in the corporate world and who's lagging. And by the way, there's a lot of different issues that are being tracked now, climate change, but beyond that, water, waste, chemical use. And then, of course, in the S agenda, who is, and Scott put some of this up there, who is moving towards a world that addresses inequality, racial justice, diversity, gender balance on boards, gender balance in the management suite. All of these are now being tracked by metrics, not all of which are good. And that's what this Values at Work book that Scott mentioned that I have just edited and is now out in the market talks about. There is a need for better metrics, better data, better tracking so that people can be quite confident as opposed to shaky in the belief that when someone says they're moving towards a sustainable future, that they're really doing it. But I think there was enormous focus on this in Glasgow, and that companies who are now making these commitments are going to find it very difficult to step back and say, oh, we were just kidding, because there is a lot of pressure to be forthcoming about how you're going to make change happen. Another signal and another reinforcement of the commitments being made was the presence in Glasgow of the heads of all of the major international organizations. Again, for the World Affairs Forum, something very important to note. The head of the World Bank, the head of the World Trade Organization, the head of the UN Food and Agriculture Program, the head of the World Health Organization, all in Glasgow, and not just for an hour to give a speech and then fly off, which is what they would have done in prior years, prior conferences. They stayed for 3, 4, 5 days, recognizing, I think, that their work now has to be brought in alignment with this global goal of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. So I think there are a whole lot of institutions and factors that are lining up behind the promise that we are facing a different future from the past, that real transformation is now required. So again, the conclusion I've come to, and I want to offer you, is that the most fundamental suggestion of encouraging news comes not from what the governments did, but what everybody else did around the governments in Glasgow. All these other institutions, all these companies, all these other players making commitments for transformative change. And I think in that regard, the push is really being carried by the business community. And I would say that the question could be asked again, are they serious? Are they real? And my suggestion to you is that there are some emerging signals that smart money is now betting on a true transformation over the next 30 years. That we are going to do what Scott mentioned, deep decarbonization, fundamentally drive down our greenhouse gas emissions. By the way, we talk loosely about carbon when we mean carbon dioxide. We talk about deep decarbonization when we really mean bringing down all greenhouse gases. So carbon dioxide, of course, but methane and some other greenhouse gases as well. But there was a lot of discussion in Glasgow about the pathways to deep decarbonization, what it's going to take. And I have done work with almost 100 researchers, scholars, policy experts from across the United States on something that we call America's Zero Carbon Action Plan, where we lay out sector by sector the change that's required. What's going to have to happen in the transport sector? The answer, by the way, is largely electrification. We're going to be, within 20 years, driving mostly all electric cars and trucks. What's going to be done in buildings? Again, electrification. If you're building a new house, don't put a gas furnace in. We're headed towards a world of electric heat as well as electric air conditioning, and perhaps with heat pumps, although reinforced in places like New England by some kind of electric heat source beyond that. Big industry, some degree of electrification. Hard to decarbonize sectors are probably going to have some alternatives, perhaps hydrogen. So a lot of discussion in Glasgow about how we're going to get not just hydrogen, but green hydrogen. The way you get hydrogen, by the way, you break apart water, but it takes electricity. So the key to having green hydrogen is to break that water apart with electricity from a clean and renewable energy source. But there's a lot of interest now in who might have those kind of power opportunities available. Solar power, perhaps hydropower. And that's where these facilities to create hydrogen are being located. I think you also saw, in an incredibly interesting way, commitments to innovation from lots of directions with huge blocks of capital. So in addition to the finance world being there, the big banks, there was an enormous representation of the venture capital world starting to bet on change. So it's the flow of money towards change that I think makes real what otherwise might have just been pledges. So let me say a few things about this idea that smart money is moving. I mentioned the car companies. Once they start putting down billions of dollars, there is no turning back. By the way, the biggest signal of this last week, I don't know if any of you benefited from this, but have you all been following the saga of Rivian? So Rivian is a new electric truck company. They did an initial public offering last week. And does anyone know what the market capitalization at the end of day one of that truck company? By the way, how many trucks has Rivian sold? Does anyone know? Zero is not right. 256. They have sold 256, most of which were sold to employees in their factory. I believe it's really sort of test driving the vehicles, but they have sold 256. And what was the market capitalization that emerged after day one of stock trading in this brand new company? 70-something billion. And by the way, the second day, over 80 billion. I think by now it's over 100 billion valuation of this company that has sold, fewer cars than there are people in this library right now, fewer trucks. Nevertheless, it is a signal that a lot of capital and a lot of smart folks, probably some from AllianceBernstein, are saying these guys are going to be winners. And maybe Ford and GM are not. Now, by the way, Ford and GM are both scrambling to align as well with this electric vehicle future. But that Rivian could, with virtually no production, no track record, get a market capitalization bigger than Ford, bigger than GM, is stunning. But it does reflect change that is real. So that's my gauge to answer this critical question that came up earlier. Further examples that smart money is moving, that the power of sustainable investors is driving change. Who knows what happened to Exxon Mobil a couple of months ago? Does anyone know who engine number one is? So engine number one is a hedge fund that decided that Exxon Mobil, with its all oil, all the time strategy, was likely to lose value in a transforming world. So they put up 3 competing candidates for director in the most recent elections for the board of directors of Exxon Mobil. They competed against 3 management nominated directors, and the engine 1-3 insurgents won. So let's be clear on what that means. 51% of the shareholders of Exxon Mobil, the perhaps biggest badass oil company out there, 51% of those people voted to throw out the management team and bring in the insurgents. It is stunning. Again, these are shareholders who knew they had bought shares, not just of an oil company, but of Exxon Mobil. This was not like the Patagonia shareholders who did this vote. This is incredible, but it suggests that the world is shifting strongly and hard, and I would say irreversibly, towards a belief that we're going to have deep decarbonization and an emphasis on a sustainable future. And that people who don't get it are at risk of causing their companies to lose value and their stock to lose value. Example number 4, the Business Roundtable. CEOs of 200 of America's biggest companies issued a new statement last year indicating that the longstanding belief that the purpose of a corporation should be to maximize shareholder returns, sometimes called the idea of shareholder primacy, derived from work of Milton Friedman at the University of Chicago more than 50 years ago. But that Friedman doctrine has now been thrown out by these guys saying, no, we're now in a world of stakeholder responsibility. And it's unacceptable for a company to profit at the expense of its employees, its suppliers, its customers, the communities it operates in, or society as a whole. Fundamental change. Basically saying it's no longer okay to maximize profits so long as you just obey the law. There is a backdrop expectation now that you are not going to privately gain at public expense. And whether that is air pollution going up a smokestack, effluent out of pipeline, greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, that it's not specifically illegal is still unacceptable. If you are putting that stuff out onto society, spilling harm onto society, profiting from those activities while burdening all of us with these costs. Very substantial change. And I think the fact that you've got these CEOs signing on to, in effect, a new baseline standard for business ethics, I think is quite dramatic as well. Now, again, are people all going to follow through? I think starts to be hard to say, oh, we were just kidding when we put out that statement. But there will be some challenges. In any case, I think you're starting to see a lot of work being done, including through this zero carbon action plan that I'm part of, to really ask sector by sector, industry by industry, what does transformative change look like? And we know it can't happen in a week or a month or a year or even a decade. It's going to be a 20 or 30-year process. But it's beginning now, and I think with some real focus. And that, by the way, is the story of this Better Planet book that some of you have already picked up. Others may want to get afterward. The Better Planet book lays out 40 different elements of what might be points of leverage for change towards a sustainable future. What are the incentives we need to bring to bear? What are the policy frameworks? What are the concepts that will help us get there? Emphasis on things like communications. A great colleague of mine, Tony Lyserowitz, has done some of the most important work on how to explain climate change to the public. Because one of the problems has been people don't understand this issue. It's quite complicated. It's an issue that seems very far in the distant, a little closer in now than it used to, but still seems in the distance. And it turns out you have to really have a science of how to explain this to folks who are otherwise not skilled science, knowledge-based people. And I think there's starting to be a recognition of that. My own chapter in the book is about the importance of innovation, but I'm also helping to articulate what I think is the broader picture here, which is that sustainability has become a societal imperative. We are going to have that as a core value of the 21st century. By the way, there's just no doubt that young people already believe this strongly. So I spend my time teaching folks who are mostly in their 20s. Across party lines, they think climate change is real, serious, and needs urgent action. Across any kind of divide you might imagine, they believe that sustainability is a fundamental thing that we have to protect. We've got to have a sustainable planet, and that it has not been attended to with the seriousness it requires in the past. So I'm looking around. I think they blame pretty much all of us in this room for not stepping up to the challenge and not taking seriously what's required to provide a habitable planet. And by the way, these young folks know that given the advances in health, they're going to pretty much live through the whole of the century. So they're going to get to see us go off the cliff if we don't get climate change right, if we don't address the crisis of biodiversity, if we don't address the crisis of waste. All of which, by the way, have interesting chapters in this book about what could be done differently and better to move us onto a sustainable trajectory. So with that, I will close and say, I think the sustainability imperative has now emerged. I think younger people get it. I think the business world now gets it as well. And that's where I really believe the leverage for change is now coming from. It was one thing to have people kind of wishing we could change and young people chanting in the streets. But the fact you've got such significant corporate commitments, finance world commitments, and that you've got this world of sustainable investors who are insisting that they want to have that alignment of their portfolios and their values is driving change at a pace that I think is unrecognizable from even a few years ago. So with that, I'm happy to take questions, comments, thoughts, suggestions. Please. And we're going to get you a microphone so that everyone online can hear you. And then we'll move it on to the next question.
Good evening, and thank you. Where does nuclear fit in, or does it?
A great question. My view is, and by the way, as I mentioned, I was commissioner of Connecticut's Department of Energy and Environmental Protection for 3 years. And this is probably the question, not nuclear specific, but people would ask me, what is the clean energy future? What is it going to be in terms of power generation? And my answer was, although I've spent 30 years thinking about this problem, you really don't want to ask me, because we've made a lot of mistakes by thinking that some expert could tell us the answer. So here's what I would say. What we really want is a clean energy race with all the contenders lined up in the starting gates. So wind power is there, solar power is there, but also kind of more cutting edge renewable energy possibilities, tidal power, wave power, geothermal power. And by the way, nuclear power. And I also am willing to put fossil fuels into that race, because every one of those power sources, potential power sources of the future, has a problem or two to solve. Wind power and solar power have to solve the problem of intermittency. What do you do when the sun's not shining, the wind's not blowing? And the answer is pretty straightforward. You need electricity storage, batteries or something else. But you need that at low enough cost that you can shift that power from day to night, from season to season, and we don't have that now. So the renewables are still not yet ready for full baseload power provision across the whole of society. Nuclear power has to solve problems too. We got to figure out what we're going to do with the waste. By the way, there's a place in Nevada waiting for it called Yucca Mountain, where it all should go, but for bad politics. And I can tell you, as commissioner of the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, responsible for several nuclear power plants. By the way, we are one of the most nuclear dependent states in America. Almost 50% of our power, clean power from nuclear, but a lot of problems because the waste is sitting in cooling tanks on the sites of these old nuclear plants. And whatever the deficiencies of Yucca Mountain are, and they're not many, it's very well researched. It is a terrible answer to have waste at 200 different sites across the country sitting in cooling pods. But nuclear has to figure out how to get the waste problem solved, the safety problem addressed, and frankly, convince people that terrorists are not going to come and take the stuff. And that's a bit of a high hurdle. Having said that, I think it's almost impossible to imagine we could get to 2050 without keeping the current nuclear fleet going and perhaps ramping up small modular reactors that can meet those tests of safety and so on. But the final real test for nuclear is economics. And it has not been able to be done cost effectively in America, in part because we have so much protest and people can block the projects from going forward. And when you borrow $10 billion to build a plant and then can't get it up and running for 8 or 10 years, you have a real problem. So I think nuclear faces challenges. And of course, fossil fuels face challenge. It could be that we could figure out how to capture the air pollution, but we also have to figure out how to capture the greenhouse gases. And as of now, that carbon capture is not cost effective. But so I think, in my mind, I'm glad somebody is betting on all of those things. So somebody is betting on geothermal, somebody is betting on wave power. And, from the perspective of someone who studies innovation, that's what we want as a society. Because it turns out innovation is very hard to predict. And you want people to try lots of different things. And you want people to, bring to bear different perspectives and different ideas. And I would say let's let all of this go, and in 10 years we can figure out what the answer is. And my expectation is that nuclear is still in the game 10 years from now. It could be that it's ramped up because people have addressed the issues that are holding it back, but it may be otherwise on the decline. Please. Got a microphone? Yes, good.
So I take from this presentation an extraordinarily optimistic point of view. That is to say that there's an inevitability given the amount of financial and corporate interest in this. On the other hand, I keep looking at street level. And for example, today's Hartford Courant had an article in which Governor Lamont has decided not to join the New England Cooperative on climate change, and in fact has said he is now fully against tolls. So I guess I'm wondering, where do you see this push and pull, the inevitability of the corporate and financial investments versus the feet on the street of Joe Manchin and the politics that Lamont is responding to?
So I think it turns out that environmental issues generally, climate change in particular, are really challenging issues for politicians to get right. They are in fact the worst structure of benefits and costs from a political point of view, which is to say you invest to reduce greenhouse gases in Connecticut, the benefits are gained across the entire world, because the greenhouse gas emissions that would have gone up in Connecticut don't just affect Connecticut, they blanket the earth. So it means that we will pay a lot for emissions reductions that 7.9 billion people get the benefit of, and 3.5 million who live here pay for. So it's an incredibly bad benefit cost ratio. The only way to get people to work together is reciprocity and feeling that we're all going to link arms and do this together. So I do think that's the challenge. And if you're a state level leader, a governor, very hard for you to think that this is going to work out well in the short run. And with political leaders that have, very short time frames, 2 years, 4 years in their terms, it's extremely tough to get them to think long term. And long term is what's required. But I do think you're starting to see business leaders who do have, ironically, because they're often accused of thinking only in the next quarterly results, but they're starting to think more long term, in part because their customers want to think more long term. And so what I see is a business world that is driven not so much by government, because there is this problem of the politics, but a business world that is facing other stakeholders, other pressures. I think that the voices of the young are very powerful. The company leaders that I was talking to in Glasgow said, look, these folks in the street, these are our future customers, they're our future employers. And if there is one principle of modern business that's perhaps most revolutionary, it is that competitive advantage no longer derives from access to low-cost capital or access to raw materials. It is based entirely on human capital. And if you can't attract and retain the very best workers, the knowledge workers, those young people who are out protesting, you don't have a future business. So I think you've got a lot of folks who are saying, I've got to figure out a way to get in alignment with where these young folks think the world is going, where my sustainable investors think the world is going. And by the way, it doesn't take a majority of investors to think this way. You've got a substantial minority, but growing number of mainstream investors who care about this ESG performance of the companies in their portfolio. And that hits a tipping point when 10 or 15% are demanding that information, never mind 50%. So we've got these vectors of pressure that I think are driving change, even though the politics is lagging. And the story I hope you've picked up from my discussion tonight is that the politics is lagging, but the world is still moving. And that's an interesting development, but perhaps a great development, because our politics in this country are so badly broken. It's not just climate change or environment that we're not performing well on. We've got a lot of issues that we need to do much better. Please.
I'm also impressed with your optimism. It's great to hear that, because I've also been pretty pessimistic around these topics. But what I'm a little bit skeptical about is the carbon offsets, the buybacks that you're talking about. And to me, it seems like a cop-out in a way that companies can buy these offsets and other companies are going to sell them, and talk about like the shareholder value and all that. Isn't that just a way for companies to shirk the responsibility of doing the hard work?
So I think the reality is, and again, this is why it's a net zero greenhouse gas emissions target, it's almost impossible to make cement without some greenhouse gas emissions. And yet society benefits from cement. We're not going to get away from cement. And when people talk about green cement, it's 90% reduced emissions, but not 100% reduced. So I do think there are some things. By the way, we also benefit from steel. It's almost impossible to make steel without having some greenhouse gas emissions. You can make the heat from a clean source, from hydrogen, but you still have a coking process that has a chemical reaction that causes greenhouse gas emissions. So you're, frankly, in some critical categories, going to have a very tough time going to zero. The question is, do we just say, okay, we'll let them get away with that? I say no, it's better to make them pay for that residual harm. And then the question, which is your question, is how do we know that what they're doing to offset that harm, those residual emissions, is real? And that's a fair question. And right now we know that you can measure and gauge what are called nature-based solutions, investments in trees and green plants, and frankly, broader land use management, how we, how farming is done. All can be done better with more carbon dioxide uptake. But it is a fair question, and one should be quite wary of a company that's making a big net zero greenhouse gas emissions pledge. And when you look beneath the surface, they're going to reduce emissions by 50%. and somehow offset 50%. That's not a successful strategy, even in a hard to decarbonize sector. And certainly not for most companies. I think that the cut in emissions needs to be 95%, or even 98% in some sectors. Now, if you're in finance, you should be reducing by 98%. If you are, aviation, if you can get it down 90%, that might be good. And I think the bottom line, let me be clear. I hope my optimism is not going too far. I think there's a lot of bumps in this road. And I think there's a lot of political obstacles, as was suggested. I do not think this is easy. But I think there is starting to be a momentum. And at some point, the flow of capital that gets invested in betting on a clean energy future and betting on this transformation to occur becomes itself a self-reinforcing cycle. And that once you get going, it's hard to turn that around. So I think there is a fair question behind what you're saying, but I think there is also work being done. And I'm more confident on the nature-based solutions than I am on carbon removals. There is now a plant that's just opened in Iceland that is doing the removals, but at about 10 times the cost of what it would take to be cost effective. Now, the people who are doing it say, well, 10 times is not that much. Solar cells have come down by a factor of 10 in the cost of electricity from a photovoltaic array. So tenfold improvement is not unheard of, but it's still big, and it will take some substantial innovation. Do we have a question coming in online?
Okay, we have this question online from Richard Ward to you and to the group. He says, the carbon deposits that have been burned over the past century took many of years to form naturally. The discussion I hear via the media seems to presume that once carbon neutrality is reached, the climate will revert to its pre-carbon rise behavior and the problem will be solved. Yet, even once carbon neutrality is reached, the accumulated carbon in the atmosphere will still be there and probably take many centuries to be reabsorbed. So won't the disruptive impact of climate change persist for many centuries?
That's a very good question. The answer is that yes, carbon dioxide persists for hundreds of years. But as we discussed, the methane is 10 to 20. And the methane, given its potency, is a significant part of the problem. So you can actually take that down dramatically and have it be gone pretty quickly. But there is going to be some climate change risk, some greenhouse effect for centuries. Although we've lived with it at a certain level, the goal is to begin to have it peak and then come down. And I think once we have it going down again, the risk starts to go down, but it's going to be a couple of 100 years. It is the reason, however, you've got some folks, the European Union most notably, committing not just to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, but to have a net negative carbon profile beyond 2050. So they're planning to take more carbon dioxide out for exactly this reason, to ensure that we're going more quickly back to what might have been the long-term equilibrium. By the way, everyone does know there is a natural carbon cycle, right? So this is a reality that lies behind all of this. There is a certain amount of carbon that's released, a certain amount that's absorbed, particularly by photosynthesis. And the challenge is that what we had, which was more or less in balance, has been thrown off over the last couple of 100 years. But we could get back to some equilibrium and then begin to drain the excess that's in the atmosphere over perhaps another 100 years. Question here.
Spoke at the beginning of your presentation.
Not sure your mic is on. There we go.
You spoke at the beginning of your presentation about the planet heading towards 8 billion people living on it. And I think most people accept the necessity of sustainability as it affects the environment. Was there any mention in Glasgow of the controversial and critical issue of population control?
So it's a very interesting point. And, if we'd had this discussion 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, that would have been the number one issue and the number one driver. As of today, a significant number of countries are in population decline, including many important countries. Russia, steep decline. Italy, steep decline. Japan, steep decline. China, flattening very rapidly. It's not true, of course, across parts of Asia, parts of Africa, where you continue to have significant growth. But I think people believe that the demographic trends now visible suggest we are flattening, although it continues to rise. And as a result, there is discussion about population. There were a lot of population conversations going on as one of the drivers of unsustainability. But it's not the prominent one that you might have imagined and would have been the case 20 or 30 years ago. Flattening, and because in so many countries now, the population is, the opposite issue is now emerging. How you sustain an economy, and particularly the retirees in an economy, when you have so few workers compared to the number of people in the senior years. All right, I think we're going to take just a couple more. We got one. Is that another one online, or okay? We'll do one here in the back row, and then we'll come back to you.
Excellent presentation, Professor Esty, and welcome back to Connecticut. I believe you had done a great work in the area of environment. Congratulations on this presentation.
Thank you.
Glasgow, I was very close to where you were. I was in London when all these delegations were descending on Glasgow. My question is, and I ask myself and I ask you, what is sustainability? We have been talking about it in the academics. The reality on the ground is so different. From Paris to Glasgow, the environment has gone, I think, worse and worse. The cities are choking with pollution. People are dying of hunger. There are 1 billion people in the world who go to bed hungry. And if you take away the Chinese statistics, there are 2 billion who do not have enough food to eat, who are food insecure and who are poor. So there are 2,775 billionaires in the world sitting on 100 trillion of wealth. So inequality has disproportionately increased and is a great challenge to the conscience of mankind.
So I think you're quite right. And I would tell you one of the interesting elements of the conversation in Glasgow was this issue of equity and the concerns about inequality and the importance of what would be now considered sustainable development, which is not just about the environment, but it is about these other related issues and the importance of addressing poverty at the same time, and a recognition, frankly, that if you don't do that, people are going to have a hard time making choices that allow the environmental issues to be taken seriously. So it's a good and a fair point. Let's do the online question.
One out of 7 child goes hungry. So how optimistic you are about sustainability? It's only remains in the realms of academics. The reality is starkly different. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's a perspective that the world is coming to appreciate, and a lot of the conversation reflects that now.
Sure. We have another question online from Karen Royce. First of all, she says, thank you for your excellent presentation. But she asks also, could you please speak more about toxic waste? You mentioned the waste from Connecticut's nuclear power plants. How about the toxic waste from electric car batteries when they're replaced? How will that be addressed? And I'll add to that also, what about the impact of the extractive industries that are mining for the materials that are going into those batteries? How do you balance out those impacts?
So I think it's a great question. My own answer to that is that we should have a new principle for environmental law that says that people should pay for the harm they cause. So if you cause waste, you should pay for it. If you cause toxics, you should pay for it. If you cause greenhouse gas emissions, you should pay for it. And I think this sounds jarring to some people, but it's actually a 500-year-old legal tradition. Basically going back to before this was a country, to the laws of England in the 1500s. We've had a principle in property rights that say if you cause harm to somebody else's property, you either have to stop it or pay for it. If you cause harm to someone else's person, this is tort law, you either have to stop it or compensate them. And so I think the idea that we should have a principle of no spillovers of harm and no consumption of shared public resources without paying for them is the starting point. And if we took that seriously, we would have powerful incentives for people to be much more careful and to ensure that they minimize whatever waste arises from their production processes in a company, including personal consumption, if we all had to pay a price for the harms and the waste we cause. And I do think there's pressure in this direction. One of the biggest areas of activity in the world is, in the academic world, is the concept of industrial ecology, that we should do more to have a circular economy, to close loops, to ensure that we're not thinking about waste as something that's acceptable, but to understand that is, the theory was that waste could be thrown away. That's in fact what we say, but it turns out there is no away. There is only other places, and then it comes back. So we really do have to think about a way to ensure that our model, and this, by the way, is happening with the car batteries. Those batteries are not thrown away. They're now recaptured, and there's a lot of precious metals in those batteries, a lot of precious rare earths, they're called. So we are seeing the recycling and recapture of a lot of materials. But we need to move in that direction much more strongly in the years ahead to achieve a truly sustainable future. So we'll take one last question here and then call it a day. Thank you all for staying with us for a long evening.
Great. Have a more prosaic question. You were running Connecticut's DEP and so forth for about 3 years. There are solar programs in every state surrounding Connecticut, and there's nothing going on in Connecticut.
That's just totally wrong. That is completely incorrect. You should call up the Connecticut Green Bank. There are enormous programs. Connecticut's one of the most successful states. It's developed a strategy. You might not like the strategy, but it provides a mechanism by which the state provides support for private capital coming in and helping you get the kind of money you would need to put a solar array on your roof. So some people do a strategy that's subsidies, which is really a 20th century strategy that is very little in the way of leverage. So in some states, you put a $30,000 array on your roof, the state will write you a check for $15,000. But that's basically $1 of government money leveraging $1 of private capital. Connecticut's Green Bank has a phenomenal model it's been now replicated in 20 states across America and 20 countries across the world, where you use your state money to de-risk the private capital that comes into the marketplace. And you end up getting a leverage of $7 of private funding for every dollar of government money that's put up. So it's a much better model for the scope and scale required to expand renewable energy.
And actually, there's a really good segue to some of the materials that we have over on one of our tables. We do have information from Sustainable CT, which is, they run training and certifications and other resources, but they're also the grant matching program. So that's over to your right, over there. We also have some information from Wilton Go Green, and an additional bibliography that the Ferguson Library kindly provided for us. But also, let's take the time to thank our speaker, Dan Esty. And thank you.
And thank you all. And thanks to those who are online as well. It's one of the great joys of our pandemic moment is that we get to have people who might otherwise not have come out. So a special thanks to the dozens that were online.
And while I still have all you here, we'll be having a book signing in back here in the library. And for those of you online, we sent out some materials prior to the event. We can send them out again. But Dan Esty's office kindly provided us with discount flyers if you'd like to buy the book after the event, or if you're not at the Ferguson Library. So thank you.